Good morning, beloved. Sorry if my laugh was distracting y'all during the announcement. I don't know if it was sympathy, but it sounded like a sympathy laugh. Somebody over here was like, ha. It just sounded so fake. It cracked me up. So if you guys want to laugh at our terrible jokes up here this morning, just feel free to support us with that. But today we're going to be doing something a little bit differently, as you might see by the setup. We are actually doing the final installment of our June series, which is the Blueprints of a Healthy Marriage. And so or a flourishing marriage. And so one thing that we're going to be doing today differently is we're actually going to be having a kind of Q&A panel with our founding pastors who have been doing a bomb job this past month just teaching about marriage. So let's give a big hand for Pastor Will and Andrea.
And this is super vulnerable for us because we've never done this. We prayed about it. We thought about it. I was supposed to preach. She was supposed to preach. But we landed on this.
And I'm third wheeling for some reason. Now, before we begin the discussion and some of the conversation, and we got some questions that married couples at our church submitted. And before we get into all of that, I wanted to give some people in the audience who might not really know Pastor Will and Andrea's history a little bit of context. So just wanted to give an icebreaker question first.
I'm nervous.
It's nothing crazy.
Okay.
What was your first impression of each other, and who pursued who first?
I could go first. Okay. So I remember when we first met, and I don't think he remembers this, but we were on a mission trip, and he was wearing a big black shirt that said LA on it. And back then, he talked a little different.
I missed that shirt. I know what shirt you're talking about.
When we got married, I threw it out. So that's where it went. That's where it went. But I remember he was there, and he's kind of a loud personality. He talked a little different back then, had a little flair, a hip-hop flair. And I remember he's like, hey, what's your name? And I was like, Andrea. And he's like, that's a beautiful name. And he walked away. And I was like, does he talk like that to every girl? But that was literally our first impression. And I don't think he remembers that.
I don't remember that at all. My first impression of her was, that's the pastor's daughter. So just stay away. Because people don't know this, but my spiritual father, who was a guest speaker the day I gave my life to Christ, is her dad. So when I was attracted to his daughter, I was like, this is not going to be good. So that was my first impression, was stay away from her, and then didn't think twice after that.
I just caught something. You just described him, but you didn't really share how you felt about him. Were you like, I don't like this guy, I like this guy's weird?
I was like, he's really outgoing. That's it. Nothing crazy. We both, I don't think we both thought about each other twice after we walked away from each other.
Yeah, we were friends for like 3 years before anything ever happened.
So who pursued who first? Okay. But who said I love you first?
Me.
It's interesting because, a lot of times people are like, you need to be like physically attracted to someone before you pursue them. I think my wife is fine. Come on, somebody. She's beautiful. And yeah, thank you.
Wow, I'm feeling the support today, guys. Thank you so much.
That's a default pastor joke. My wife is hot.
The first 3 years, though, I didn't think anything about her. But it was actually, we co-led a mission trip once. And for me, it was like the way, this is weird, man. It was the way she was praying. She was like weeping while she was praying. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, that's what I've been looking for my whole life. I was like, a girl who loves Jesus. And that's like, I just started like, I was kind of sprung. And we were leading that mission trip together. And we instilled the rules. And the rules were, you can't do any dating or flirting on this trip. I broke every single code. I was like, hey girl, I know we're supposed to be leading this trip. But I told her on the mission trip, on a 6-hour bus ride on purpose, I was like, can you sit next to me? She's like, oh, sure, why not? And then on that bus ride, I was like, I really like you. And she was like, I was like, I know you don't like me, but I just want you to know I want to be up front because I used to be a player. I ain't going to play no games. I like you, and I'm coming after you. That's pretty much what I said. That's how it started.
That's the youth group trifecta. My wife is hot, bus ride, and missions flame, right? You hit the Trinity. Let's move on because this is quickly going to derail. So we're in a series called Blueprints for a Flourishing Marriage. And Pastor Will, I just wanted to start off the conversation today as our last installment for the series. What was your heart behind this series?
Yeah, you know, if I could go back and retitle the message, I would throw in Blueprints for a Christ-centered flourishing marriage, which is why I, created a sermon series based out of Ephesians 5. And honestly, the vision in my heart and my prayer during the whole preparation time was that people will understand that their individual relationship with Jesus is the most important thing that's going to affect their marriages. And that's why for the first several weeks, I continued to hammer that it's your own personal devotion, your own personal repentance that is going to be the foundation and fuel to any Christ-centered marriage. Because the temptation after you live with someone for a long time is to think that they're the problem, is to think that they have issues. But the narrative of Scripture is to examine yourself, is to look into your own heart and know not only are you selfish, you're actually a sinner that is broken by the depravity of your own sinfulness. And unless you are aware of and you're willing to accept that you yourself have issues, it will just be a cycle of fighting and blaming. I prepared a few verses for you from Apostle Paul that I thought was very insightful. Apostle Paul, in the beginning of his ministry, this is what he says. In 1 Corinthians, he starts like this: "For I am the least among the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." That's what he writes early in his ministry. He says, I'm the least among the apostles. In the middle of his ministry, later on, about 10 years later in 62 AD, he says, "To me, though, I am the very least among the saints that grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ." And by the end of his life, when he's in prison writing to Timothy, he says the saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. Other translation says, I am the chief of all sinners. Why do I say this? The closer he got to Christ, the more sinful he realized he was. You would imagine that the closer you get to Christ, the more holy you feel. The more he progressed in his intimacy with Jesus, the more broken he realized he was, the more sinful he realized he was. So the progression is, I'm the least amongst the apostles, I'm the least amongst Christians, I'm the least amongst the worst of them all. So in my marriage, and my prayer has been that we will resolve to believe that you are more of a sinner than you could possibly ever imagine. And that's been my heart. And when you realize and you resolve that you are the worst sinner possible, you experience his grace and mercy and forgiveness like you've never done before. A last quote from Jonathan Edwards, and I saw my friend Iniola that goes to our church, she put on her story. Jonathan Edwards said, "I have decided to be suspicious of nothing but my own heart." When you're married, rather than being suspicious of your wife's heart, you have to be most suspicious of your own heart. That has been really the driving factor of this series and seeing how the gospel plays out in that.
I think when I think about this series, and just, I try to be William's ghostwriter, try to help him with his content a little bit and be a sounding board. But when it comes to sanctification and just his heart behind the series, we were just talking about what sanctification and how it plays out in our marriage. And I can be the first to say that I think William does an amazing job, and I get very surprised at how he's so prone to look at himself before he looks at me. And I think that actually has a lot to do with our upbringing, because his story is, I ruined everyone's lives. I was doing things I shouldn't have done. I was causing my parents a lot of pain. I was, leading my friends the wrong way. And it's because of me, like, I've caused so much damage. And when he met Christ, his narrative changed, where he's like, wow, in the midst of this, God loves me. In the midst of this, he has a plan for me. So he's more prone to look at himself, whereas for me, I feel like I have no problems. I'm just kidding. But like for me, I didn't have a narrative that way. I feel like for me, I'm more prone to shut down. And so I shut down. And I'm not as prone to quickly blame myself as much, honestly, I am, as to look out at him. And that has been a sanctification process for me, is to look inward to myself before I look at him. So
That's so good. Thank you. Like, big confession. When you first started this series, my wife and I would be sitting next to each other listening to this sermon, and Pastor Will would say, look at yourself more than your partner. And I would look at my wife and I'd be like, he's talking to you. And then she would look at me and be like, you should listen. Take notes, right? We just keep, so a lot of the times marriage sermons, it's like, oh, I'm going to clip that, send it to my partner. But he's talking to you, right? Moving forward, at the conclusion of your message last week, you talked about how Apostle Paul says that wives should love their husbands and husbands should die for their wives. And at the end of the day, that means wives want to know that they're loved and men want to know that they're respected. How has that played out in your marriage?
Yeah, Apostle Paul, what's interesting is he says that husbands and wives are to mutually submit to one another as if out of reverence for Christ, which was revolutionary at a time to tell men to submit to their wives. And now, obviously, and then he actually says, husbands are to love their wives as Christ loves the church, and wives are to respect their husbands. And he makes a distinction at that point. And when I was reading that passage and doing so much research, pretty much I came to the conclusion that at the end of the day, my wife needs to know that she's the most important thing in my life. Not just psychologically, she has to feel it experientially. And then I realized what I'm longing for my wife is that at the end of the day, she trusts me, that she believes in my intentions, that I'm trying my best. And for me, what love looks like, the only way I could say it is this: I've had to study my wife. We are so different in so many ways. And what I've had to learn is I've had to pursue her. I've had to ask questions. And I've had to discern for the last 15 years of being together, what do I do to make her feel seen? What decisions do I make to make her feel safe? And what is it about her that I must understand to make her feel like she's the most important thing? And it's pretty much a living document. I have to woo it out of her. I have to seek her and serve her and sacrifice for her so that she feels safe enough to start expressing what her needs are. So for me, it's been a continual journey. It's like, I'm going to understand you for the rest of my life. And I'm going to continue to pursue you until I understand. And then I'm going to continue to adjust my life over and over and over. Not perfectly, because everybody knows marriage is crazy. Crazy. This week was crazy for us. This whole series, I'm going off notes, but we prepared a sermon series on marriage. And this whole month has been rough on our marriage. So for me, love is, I got to study her and then adjust my life to fill her soul.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I feel like when we first got married, there was a lot of assumptions that we would make about each other. And one of the assumptions was he would say things like, honey, I know you're going to say yes. I got invited to speak at this event or this conference, and I know you're going to say yes, so I just said yes. And I'm like, what? And that would really hurt me, because I feel like, one, okay, I was going to say yes, but I don't feel like you're regarding me. I don't feel like you're thinking about my needs. And what if I did want to say no? You already said yes. And so that's a small thing, but it would kind of pour into every part of the earlier years of our marriage. And what's actually happened in the past few years, and I just want to take a moment to brag about my husband. I want to brag about you, honey. I feel like, I'm going to tear up. just to be honest with you guys, one of my traumas is that I didn't have a voice. I had to say yes. Life felt kind of crazy, and for ministry, my mom and dad are amazing. They loved us so much, but we didn't have a lot of say in where we're going to move, where we're going to go. Every day looked different. It was chaotic. And so for me, my yes is actually very important. And I didn't know early in our marriage that him not asking me actually deeply wounded a wound that was already there. It was deepening it. And so what happened is these past few years, he's made it so explicitly clear to me, I'm going to say no to everything you want me to say no to, and I'm going to do it joyfully. And he's made it a point where he tells me, I'm not doing it because I have to, honey. I'm doing it because I want to. I'm going to say no to all of these opportunities because it's a joy for me as your husband to love you this way. And it's brought so much healing to my wound where now I'm like, you could have said, yes, honey, that's fine. I probably would have said yes. And he's like, but I thought you wanted me to ask you. But we've come to a point where that healing has taken place. And that's just, and now that's that joy where he explicitly tells me, I joyfully say no to these opportunities. I joyfully say no to me hanging out with the boys.
And I'm going to give it right back to her. When I say joyfully, I'm not talking about emotionally joyfully. I'm talking about sacrificially joyfully. It's not that I don't want to advance my career. It's not that I don't want to go out with the boys. It's that I am choosing joyfully to sacrifice what I want. Because covenantal love is passion and promise. Remember? It's delight and duty. And when my delight's not there, I remember my duty as a husband is to lay down my life as Christ lays down his life. And though I don't want to, I ask Jesus, help me to choose to serve her. And what I realized is my joy follows my decision. People think you got to be dutiful after delight. No, it's my dutiful obligation. People hate language like that in love. No, it's my dutiful obligation to be a father that brings the delight for my children. In the same way, it's my dutiful obligation to put her first that then brings the joy back after my sacrificial decisions. Again, I don't do it perfectly. I do it sinfully. Back to you.
Well, and just to go off script a little bit, for me, back in December, we've had a past few years. For those of you that are new, we shared that in 2020, William had a mental breakdown. And that was really tough on our marriage. That was tough on me because I had to do a lot of heavy lifting. And that's where the duty came in. I was like, okay, I need to just, I need to be there for him. And back in December, I actually... I think after all these years of our marriage getting better and our church doing well, I think my body started to say, it's time for you now to release that tension in your body. And what happened was back in December, I started having insomnia. I started having panic attacks, and I didn't know what was going on. And I felt terrible as a wife because I was like, honey, I can't be alone at night. I know I'm supposed to preach, but I just can't right now. I know I was supposed to preach next month, but I can't. And I remember that all of my childhood narratives, you just need to keep going. You need to figure it out. You need to perform harder. You need to work harder, turned on to 100 miles per hour. And I was like, I'm going to figure out my sleep. I'm going to figure out what's going on with me. I don't know what's wrong, but I'm going to figure it out. And as I was tanking for about a month, he sat me down and he said, honey, I'm here for you. I'm going to preach. I'm going to pick up the kids. I'm going to drop off the kids. You know what? Cooking, I'll figure it out, And he said, and I don't do this because it's a burden, but I want to. I do it with, again, joy. And he's like, but you just need to tell me what you need from me. And these past few months have been that for me, where I'm like, wow, I have a hard time articulating what my needs are. I have a hard time feeling like I'm a burden to him and people around me, but he's had to sit me down and say, you need to articulate it because it is my joy, my duty, my responsibility. I'm going to do this. And he's really had to step in these past few months. And so I wanted to share that because there's a lot of parts of that I feel like translate into the later parts of this conversation.
You want to talk about the cycle?
Yes.
Love and respect?
Yeah, so when it comes to love and respect, there was an image that I wanted to share with you guys. I know the last sermon, he ended with saying that, men want to know, husbands want to know that your wives trust you, and wives, we want to know that we're loved and cherished. And we came across this image that we thought was so accurate to the crazy cycle that we experience, where without love, without feeling like they're a priority, wives react. And we react with what? Criticism. We react with resentment. We react with attack words and fight words. And then without our husbands now feel disrespected. What? I'm trying so hard to lead us. I'm trying so hard to put your needs before mine. I'm trying, and without the respect, then he reacts. And he shuts himself down, or he starts criticizing too. And it's this crazy cycle where without love, she's going to react. And without respect, he's going to react. And I just want to transition to talking about respect. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm going to talk about respect. So I'm going to transition where we talk about respect, because I feel like for me, respect as a wife, I would define it as respect is building up my husband. It's building up William. I'm going to build him up with my words. I'm going to cover him. I'm going to affirm him. I'm going to encourage him. But I'm also going to build him up with my actions. I'm going to serve him and show him that I'm thinking about him. And when I think about respect, I think for women or for wives, it's really hard, because it's like, I'm going to respect him when he deserves it. Can I get real, right? Am I the only one? I'm like, okay, he doesn't deserve it today. He was rude. He didn't think about me, or, and the thought is I'm just going to show respect when he deserves it. But I found I need to respect him for two reasons. And the first is this: Scripture tells me to. I need to submit to him. In Ephesians, it says that we are to submit to one another out of our reverence for Christ. And wives are to submit to their husbands as the head of the household, as Christ is the head of the church. And for me, if I go into a mode of I'm going to respect him when he deserves it, that's not the gospel. And what it does is I'm planting seeds of resentment. I'm planting seeds of unforgiveness in him. And so I found that I have to respect. I respect even when he doesn't deserve it, even when we're going through a hard time, when I feel offended, when I feel like it's tough, I'm going to respect him, because that is what a blueprint for a flourishing marriage, Christ-centered marriage, looks like.
Yeah, and this was kind of hard for us to prepare, because, the reason why I like to preach through the Bible is like the Bible says things that I don't really think about, or sometimes that's not a part of our culture. I don't think I've ever once said respect me. I don't, that's not my wiring. But when I was thinking about respect, because I pastor so many men, a lot of the things that we struggle with is when our wives criticize us, right? Because criticism, it makes you feel like they're judging your character. I want to ask you, and we're trying to be careful here, because we don't want to make it look like our marriage is perfect, because it's not. But I've never felt criticized by you, like ever. And I have deep issues. like everyone who works on my staff, they look at Andrea like, oh my God, I'm sorry, right? But but one thing that's been unique, instead of criticizing me, what you've been so good at is expressing your needs. Instead of correcting me, I've noticed that you've developed a skill to express your needs, and you make it more about what you need versus what I'm not doing. Do you have any insight as to why you don't criticize me?
It's called wisdom. It's called wisdom, wives. Some might call it manipulation, but I found when I look at William and I tell him, honey, you're doing an amazing job. I saw you change that diaper. I saw you clean our room when I wasn't watching. No, but seriously, I actually make it a point to encourage the life out of him. I make it a point to build him up when I can see that he's really down. And I try to put my offense aside. I try to put all the things that I want to bring up aside because I can see that he needs me to build him up right now. And I don't criticize because that's the vision I have for our marriage. I know that for a lot of times for women, it's like, well, I want him to lead, and my husband's not leading me. Or I know sometimes the temptation is like, well, he's not doing this, and this is why I do this, right? But for me, I found that if I want him to lead, if I want him to feel safe enough to lead, I need to build him up. If I want him to feel safe enough to make decisions for our family and to protect me, to protect our kids, to step in, I need to make sure that he knows I trust him and that I got his back. And so for me, there are many times where I can tell he comes home, and the vision I have for our marriage and our household is he comes home knowing that I'm going to be there to pick him up. I'm going to be there to lift him up. And it's not perfect because there are days where I have a hard time, but I found that I have to communicate that. I have to tell him, honey, you might be looking for some encouragement right now, but I need you to know I had a tough day too. I know that right now you might need me to, this is what you need, this is what I perceive you need, but I had a rough morning and I just want you to know that. So it's a lot of communication and letting him know I want to do these things, but it might be tough in this moment.
I'll say one last thing that I'll never forget. So people don't know this, but I pursued her for about almost 3 years before she said yes to me. So I just tried. I was like, come on, girl. Like, there's nobody else. It's you and me. Please. What else do I need to prove? And I remember, her story, pastor's kid. She's a working professional. She had this vision. And after we got together, I said, what changed? And I remember she said, I feel safe with you now. I was like, what you mean? She's like, I thought you were crazy. You were a pastor at 18. You were living with 7 guys that you were discipling. You didn't care about how you dressed or you looked. You were kind of cuckoo. And she said, it wasn't until I felt safe, until I felt like, oh, this guy knows where he's going. And I realized, I know she was joking around as wisdom, but some of the husbands are like, man, I just want my wife not to criticize me. My exhortation to you is then live a life that's not worth criticizing. Live in the type of servitude and humility that doesn't make her need to, right? So it's not just that I think she respects me, which she does, and that's just it feels weird saying that. But she just honors me, and I try to honor her the same way. So we have that third question that a lot of couples were asking about. Yes.
Yeah, before we get into that third question, though, I just wanted to take a moment to just commend y'all as role models, as mentors, as our pastors, because you guys model communication for me and my wife all the time. You guys model being students of one another all the time. So you guys are just, like pooping on yourself a lot. So I just wanted to say you guys are doing a great job, and you guys really do have a marriage worth learning from. And so I just wanted to encourage you with that. And also, Andrea, thank you for sharing about your tough chapter since December. And your brokenness pastors us way more than your perfection pastors us. And so I think everybody is learning. And I'm super encouraged by y'all. Like, you guys are the living example of grass isn't greener on the other side. It's on the side that you water. Because you watered him in 2020 when he had his episode, and you watered her in her episode. And yeah, I just wanted to say I'm super thankful for you guys as role models. Now, to have the hardest pivot and the most ridiculous segue, this next question was a hot topic amongst a lot of married couples at our church. And they wanted to expand a little bit more on this idea because you've been mentioning physical intimacy a lot on stage, right? For some of us, it's like, yes, please talk about it. For some other people growing up in the church, it's like, ooh, I don't know. It's kind of weird hearing my pastor talk about this topic. But it's real, y'all. So we need to address it. How has physical intimacy between the both of you impacted your marriage?
Yeah, a few thoughts on this. I'm trying to think if I should start with a joke. I remember we were with like a bunch of couples, married couples, hanging out, and there's one single person, and we were kind of just talking about physical intimacy. And the single person was like kind of like eyes like this, and they were like, "Don't you guys have sex like every day?" And we were like, "Nah. I don't know what happens when you get married. It's like once a month, once every 3 months." And single people are like, "What?" I heard a quote recently, and someone said this: "When you're single, the devil tempts you. When you're in the dating phase, the devil tempts you to have sex before marriage. When you get married, the devil tempts you to not have sex once you're married." That's a powerful quote. In 2020, when I was having a mental breakdown, before that mental breakdown, my wife and I, our marriage was shaking, like shaky. And I was hanging out with my friend, and I was opening up. Yeah, it's been tough. And the first thing he asked me was, "How often are you guys physically intimate?" I was like, "Once every 3 weeks, once a month." He was like, "Bro, that's your problem. Make it 2 to 3 times a week." I was like, "Bro, I'm just too tired, man. She's too tired. We can't do this." I have a verse for you, 1 Corinthians 7, 3 through 5, and this is what it says. "The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time, so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control." What this passage says is sex and physical intimacy is actually not about your own pleasure. It's actually about the pleasure of your spouse. Because he says, husbands, fulfill the sexual needs of your wife, and wives, fulfill the sexual needs of your husband. And what I've had to learn over the years is in physical intimacy, around 2020, I've made another resolution. Every time we're physically intimate, my goal is to please her. My goal is to serve her. And when our physical intimacy dwindles, now I see it as spiritual warfare. The enemy is tempting us in our marriage by a lack of physical intimacy. So what that meant for us is a lot of communication of how this is going to play out in our marriage. So at that point, my wife said to me, "I want it on the calendar." I was like, "What? Where's the spice? Like, where's the, come on, like, you're looking fine, girl, let's do it right now." She's like, "No, I don't like it like that." I was like, "What?" And so we actually had to learn a lot of communication and knowing how to please and serve one another. And that's how we ended up with our third kid, fam. It wasn't even planned. So you want to share a little bit? You want to share a little bit to that?
What am I? Okay. Sorry, guys. We had. It's so funny. This conversation's taking a lot of twists and turns. But for me, I think it's really important to recognize that there's a lot of things that, from our individual and personal lives, our upbringing, our values, things that are brought into the bedroom. And I thought, this is me growing up in church, no one's talking about sex. They're telling you to be pure, but no one's talking about the beauty of sex. You know, I grew up in the purity culture where it's like, don't ask questions, be pure until you're married, that's it. And so for me, no one talked about the beauty of sex, the intimacy of sex. Sex as something that God gifted a husband and wife for intimacy. And so when we got married, I was like, let's just do it. And later I'm like, oh my gosh, this is kind of tiring. And you want it spontaneous, but I'm like tired all the time. And you ask at the worst times. And you know, and for I think a lot of wives.
It's like 11.
I've consulted with a few wives in our church, but you might feel that, right? It's like, well, this is just not a good time. You ask at the worst times. You're not thinking about me. And then it turns into a fight. And then the husband's like, well, now I feel rejected because you don't want to be physically intimate with me, when that was an intimate ask to begin with. And I found it's a cycle, right? And what happened for me is, I was like, honey, I agree. I think sex and physical intimacy has very much transformed our marriage. I believe it really has. Because when you're too tired to be intimate with one another, that says a lot about your schedule and your pace of life more than it does yourselves. And what we realized is in 2020, we were so burned out. We were doing way too much ministry, overbooking and scheduling ourselves to a point where we weren't prioritizing our bedroom and our intimacy and our marriage. And so I told him, I agree with you. I do. I think we should. And I said, but I want it weekly or, okay, whatever, weekly. And I want it on the calendar so I know and I could expect it and I could be excited for you. It's no longer like, oh my gosh, you want it now? Like, oh gosh, right? But it's more like, honey, it's coming. This day is coming.
I felt so much pressure. I'm like, oh, the day's here. Fudge, I gotta.
And now it's gone to a point where I'm like, I'm excited, and and now he doesn't feel rejected. He doesn't feel like, oh, you don't want to be intimate with me. And I found that even for myself, I told you in church, we didn't grow up with that, talking about sex. And so for me, I thought, it's just something you do. It's not necessarily a gift. I don't know about the beauty behind it, but for me, what I found as a wife is when I position myself from intimacy, physical intimacy as a form of a gift for us, and I had to position myself as uncomfortable at it as it was for me in the beginning, from a giver of intimacy to a receiver of intimacy. I had to figure that out for myself. I'm not just doing this because you want it. I'm doing this because I want it too. And what does that look like for me? And that changed everything because it's no longer like my husband just wants it and it's an inconvenience for me and it's an itch I have to satisfy or something, but it's more like, no, this is for us. This is for our marriage. And I had to really shift. That change in perspective actually changed everything for us in that regard.
Yeah, And I think the reason why the scriptures confines physical intimacy within the context of covenantal love is because now we live in a culture where it's like, hey, just if you love each other, do this. It's because covenant safeguards the consequences of physical intimacy. It is the most vulnerable and intimate gift you could offer somebody. And it's in the confines of, I will never leave you. I am with you forever. That makes this gift from God to be experienced for what it was supposed to be. Rather than just giving your body away, giving your body and bringing it into your marriage bed. But God has created these boundaries for it to flourish in a certain context. And you don't have to answer this. You know that question I was going to ask? Should I not ask it?
No, you can ask it.
Or maybe I shouldn't. It's TMI. Is it TMI?
Our audience is
People are
mature
feeling
enough. They can handle
uncomfortable.
it.
We should have had like a sign. Hey, if your kids are here, take them out right now. We forgot to mention that at that moment.
She got earmuffs on. It's okay. She's not listening.
Hey, dads, I'm sorry. Got to have this conversation. Can I? You want me to, you think you'll help? You think you'll help people? Is your answer going to be helpful to people, you think? If not, we can move on.
They want it now.
There was one time, and only one time after we were physically intimate, my wife started crying. Not out of like shame, but out of like safety. And she was just crying out, just holding her, and she just kept crying. Why were you crying after that?
You guys thought it was going to be like crazy, huh? But that was strange because that day, I shared with you guys that back in December, and actually even November, I started experiencing trauma trying to leave my body, my all the things that I had been through. And just to give you guys a picture, I had insomnia for months. I literally couldn't sleep because I had panic attacks. I felt like someone was going to kidnap me, all of those things. And there were nights where he would have to hold me and say, honey, you're safe. You're okay. And he would stay up with me as I'm crying, trying to calm myself down. And then, so as we've been going through that, and I've been recognizing, okay, I've experienced these things in my childhood. This is why I have a hard time speaking up for myself. This is why I have a hard time being vulnerable. This is why I have a hard time voicing my needs. And it's all making sense to me. And there was one time we had intimacy. And after he hugged me, and I just started crying, and I couldn't stop because I felt my body feeling safe. Like, this is the most intimate space where someone is experiencing the most intimate part of you, and you are perfectly safe. There is no judgment. There is no need to perform. In fact, you're in this space to receive love and to be loved on. And I just started breaking down crying because I was like, I just feel so safe and loved right now. And that journey that I've been on for these past 7 months, where I felt so vulnerable, where I couldn't offer anything to anyone around me, especially William. He had to really pick up our family and pick me up. That intimacy we experienced, I just felt so, just safe. I think that's the word. And I actually I think he was shocked too, because he's like, are you okay? Are you okay? You know? But I think we were both, that was a moment where we both realized the sacredness of that intimacy that husband and wives are supposed to experience.
I just have a quick follow-up question, because this is something that you guys taught me that was really helpful, and I feel like it would be practical for a lot of married couples in our congregation. In therapy, I learned that there are two types of arousal. There's accumulated arousal, so people who like it planned, or like all day long, you got to be flirting with me so that I can look forward to it. It's accumulated. And then another one, which Pastor Will, you resonate with, is spontaneous. And I think a lot of couples fall into that pattern. One person has accumulated and the other person has spontaneous. Now, it's not just you accommodating to Andrea. I know, Andrea, you've also accommodated to Pastor Will's more spontaneous needs. Can you kind of walk through how that process happened?
Yeah, I kind of want to move on from physical intimacy, but you got to meet halfway. You got to feel safe and seen enough to communicate, and then come up with a ongoing live document that works for the seasons that you're in. We have young kids. We're at church planning together. We work together. It's so easy to just become coworkers, but it's communicating our needs, me sacrificing, her sacrificing, me expressing some of my needs, her expressing her needs, and coming up with a collaborative plan that works for both of our needs. It's either lose-lose, win-lose, or win-win. Always look for the win-win. The problem with conflict is usually one person loses and one person wins, or if both are prideful, you lose, I lose, both lose, you suck, I suck, what? You want to get to the win-win. What is your win? What is my win? How can we meet in the center by out-serving each other as Christ has served us? That's in essence what it is. Yeah.
And also speaking on conflict, which is something that every partnership is going to go through, what have you done individually and as a couple in order to work through conflict resolution?
Yeah. This will be the last question. You want to start off about conflict resolution, assuming?
So for us with conflict resolution, that's another sharp change, right, in our conversation. But for conflict resolution, I think one thing that we had talked about that I felt like I should share is that we've worked really hard to eliminate assumptions from each other in our days. And what we found is that we try to check in with each other regularly. And at first, we would say, how was your day? And he would tell me what he did. But now we go deeper, like, so what are you feeling right now? Is there anything that I should be aware of? Sometimes I didn't know, but he had a tough day at work and he comes home and he's, stressed out in his mind. And he tells me what he did, but I don't know what's actually happening in here in his heart and mind. And before I would assume, oh, he just doesn't want to talk right now. He's tense. I'm bothering him. And I would make all these assumptions, but now we have regular forms of check-in where we check in with each other. So that's one form of assumption. Another assumption is we always assume the best of each other. I think that's very important. Instead of jumping quick to conclusions about he just doesn't want to be here right now, he doesn't want to do this for me right now, I make the assumption that he really wants to do this, but he must be really tired. He really wants to be here right now, but there must be something that is weighing down on him. And so I think we try to assume the best of each other. Yeah.
And that took some time. Because I'm an Enneagram 8, which is a need to be against. So I just always think she wants to fight. It took me like 7 years to actually believe she doesn't want to fight. I was like, you want to fight? She's like, no. I'm like, yes, you do.
7 years, guys. 7 years of me saying,
like,
I'm not trying to fight right now.
I'm like, don't lie. You said that to hurt me. She's like, I really didn't. I'm like, yeah, you did. If you did it, why'd you say it like this? She's like, I don't know. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, maybe she really doesn't want to hurt me. And so I had to learn to assume the best. And this is the big shift. We've been talking about this every message. Instead of criticism, be curious. Instead of correction, show compassion. And what has that looked like in our marriage is love always protects. Love always hopes, which means assumes the best. 1 Corinthians 13 is I try my best to lead with questions and not accusations. I try to lead with curiosity and not statements. So it's no longer, why'd you do this? Or like, I can't believe you did this. It's, how are you feeling? What's going on here? I'm curious, and I'm trying to match my curiosity followed by compassion, right? So a small example is this. I learned this new about myself, and if y'all didn't watch Inside Out, you must watch it. But she's a flight, I'm fight. So fight mode is when someone stresses me out, the next person when I was growing up as a kid, I used to have this narrative in my head, hey, just look at me wrong. The next person, I swear, you just look at me wrong, you done. And you could be a stranger. Like, step on my shoe. These brand new Forces and Cortezes, step on them, I'll kill you. I know it sounds extreme, but it's my fight mode. Sometimes at work, I had a tough meeting with Danny or with Jimmy or with Jane. And we're all human. We love each other, or with Jason. And I'm stressed. I come home, she doesn't know I'm on fight mode. She doesn't know. I don't even know I'm on fight mode.
I'm like, hey, honey.
No, she goes like, oh, I see the dishes. I see them too. In the past, she'd be like, what? Now she's like, oh, he must have had a hard day. A perfect example, and I'll close with this. Even my daughter this week, this is so insightful. She's also fight mode, my first child. This Friday, she came home. Everything, she just was going crazy on us. She's like, I don't want to do this. And she pushes her brother, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, stop. What are you doing? Stop. Right? So I see me. I'm like, don't be like me, please. And she's 6 in a couple weeks. After the night, it was like 4 things in a row. She was just angry. I read to her at night, and after I'm done reading, I was like, Bear, we had a tough night with you and me, huh? She's like, Daddy, I had a tough day. I was like, oh, what do you mean? She's like, I got in a fight with Ava. I got in a fight with, what was the other girl's name? Monroe. I got in a fight with Raylyn. And she said, oh, and then Chloe accidentally tripped me. And then she shows me her body, and she's bleeding on her a scab. And I was like, oh, tell me more. And she was like, yeah, Ava. And I was like, oh my gosh. She brought into the house her fight mode. And I just expected her to be what I thought she was supposed to be. But because of my lack of curiosity and compassion as a father, I judged her. I should have slowed down. So now I'm like, every time my wife is upset, I always tell myself, there's always a reason. Always. It's never because she wants to fight. There's something happened. I got to pull it out of her. And same for me. All that being said, y'all, we're closing. The timer we're minus 8 minutes. So this is what we're going to do, all right? Give a hand for Jimmy. What an amazing host that did this so well for us. As the praise team comes up,